Slaves, both African and Indian, were part of everyday life in Spanish Florida. Some scholars believe the Seminoles themselves kept runaway blacks as slaves. American colonists depended on African labor for their homes and plantations. In June 2003, I talked to the author of a book about a woman whose long life was defined by the experience of slavery in Florida.
A woman of property, a woman of substance, a dominant sort of personality, strong-willed, it seems to me. If there ever was someone strong-willed, Anna would be the one you would think of.
University of Florida historian Dan Schafer. For nearly 30 years, he's traveled to Europe, the Caribbean, and West Africa, researching the life of a legendary woman whose name is the title of the new book, Anna Kingsley, African princess, Florida slave, plantation slave owner. She was born in the interior of what is now Senegal in the state of Jollof at a time of war and political chaos.
There's no way to have any hard evidence on this, but I think that I've made the link that Anna Kingsley was, as a girl, Anta Majajin Njai, that her father was in the royal lineage and that he led a dynastic dispute to become the king or the ruler of Jollof, and he lost.
But in the fall of 1806, worse misfortune was in store for Anta when her village was raided and burned by a roving band of warriors, and she and her people were shackled and marched to the coast near present-day Dakar to be sold to European slave traders. A month later, on the auction block in Havana, she was bought by 41-year-old Zephaniah Kingsley, sea captain, trader, and plantation owner. He brought her back to Laurel Grove, his 3,000-acre plantation on the west bank of the St. Johns River, south of present-day Jacksonville. It was $1 million operation by today's standards.
She came into Spanish East Florida in November of 1806. She was 13 years old at the time and pregnant, and became Zephaniah Kingsley's wife and household manager.
5 years later, Kingsley legally freed his wife, now called Anna, along with their 3 children.
1 year later, she moved across the river to her own homestead in Mandarin. Zephaniah gave to her 12 slaves, so this African woman enslaved became a free black woman in Florida and herself a slave owner.
But in 1813, Anna was once again caught up in violence as American patriots swept in from the north, seeking to overthrow the Spanish government, burning and looting all before them.
She protected her own children and actually, in a daring venture, burned Laurel Grove Plantation to drive the patriots away. And then she went across the river and burned her own homestead so that they couldn't find protection in the buildings there and attack the Spanish.
It should be right down here. There was one that they said they got.
At the Kingsley Plantation Historic Preserve on Fort George Island, tourists stroll along a path by the ruins of slave quarters built in 1814. Here at the mouth of the St. Johns River, the family lived in peace for the next 20 years. Under liberal Spanish rule, slaves and free people worked side by side. At the Kingsley Plantation, slaves worked for the master until 2 p.m., after which their time was their own. A slave could grow produce or do other work, for example, and eventually buy his own freedom.
It created more avenues for slaves to find ways to mitigate their condition.
University of South Florida historian Phil Levy.
Within the Spanish Empire, slaves were often Catholic. They had the protections of the church, so that things like marriage carried the weight of a sacrament in Spanish slavery, so that marriages, for example, could not be broken up by a slave master, whereas they were routinely broken up by slave masters in North America, in Anglo-North America.
But times were changing. Florida became an American territory in 1821. Settlers moving in saw whites as free people and blacks only as slaves. Fearing for the safety of their extended family, slaves, and free blacks, the Kingsleys packed up and began again on a plantation on the island of Haiti. When Zephaniah Kingsley died in 1843, one of his sisters in Florida sued to disinherit everyone of mixed blood. Anna returned to fight in the courts and eventually win back her inheritance. By the beginning of the Civil War, this racially mixed matriarchal family and colony of free blacks controlled nearly 10,000 acres just east of what is today downtown Jacksonville.
There were 70 free blacks living there, just an amazing aberration in a state where free blacks were so scarce. It was against the law to free people. You could free them, but they had to be out of the state within 60 days. But the Kingsleys freed, and they stayed. and they then worked for the Kingsley family and continued those close interrelationships.
Anna Kingsley died in 1870. Historian Dan Schafer believes she's buried in an unmarked grave in a family cemetery behind a historic Jacksonville home.
Her entire life was periodically marked by turmoil, warfare, captured as a teenager and enslaved and sold, becomes a free woman. There's an invasion again. She burns her property. She's a refugee from racism when she goes to Haiti. She comes back again, and then at the very end of her life, the Civil War is on. And so it seems to me that would be one of the dominant themes of her life. A remarkable story of survival.
We're dealing very much in our time period with legacies of slavery, trying to define what those legacies are. And we're also, as Floridians, sort of interested in the exceptionalism of a state that in many ways doesn't seem to fit the norm. It's an odd place. So stories like this that are exceptional, that tell something about Florida that's different than something you'd hear in South Carolina, become very useful. They become very interesting.
The book is Anna Magagene Jai Kingsley, published by University Press. I'm Bill Dudley. With funding from the Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, this report was produced by the Florida Humanities Council. Find out more about our current initiative, Telling Florida Stories, on the web at flahum.org.